She stood behind a curtain of white lace, and no one in that auction hall would raise a hand. You know what it means when a room full of men goes quiet like that. It means they've already decided something about a person without knowing a single true thing about her. But one man walked to the front, set down the fee, and never once asked to see her face first. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Right, a curtain of white lace, a silent room, and a debt that was about to become something neither of them had the language for yet. Because what looked like a transaction on that Tuesday morning in early November turned out to be the beginning of the only life either of them would have chosen if choosing had ever been offered to them before. Her name was Carla Voss, and she had come to the valley the way most people came to hard places, not because she wanted to, but because she had run out of softer ones. She was 26 years old in the autumn this story begins, and she had been traveling for 11 days by the time she stepped off the stage at the edge of Mineral Creek. 11 days of dust and bad water, and a leather seat that left a bruise she would feel for 2 weeks afterward. She had $14 in a cloth pouch, pinned inside her coat, a trunk with a broken latch, and a letter she had read so many times. The paper had gone thin at the folds. The letter was from a woman named Dora Hensley. Dora had been her mother's closest friend, the kind of friendship that starts young and survives everything, the kind that doesn't need tending because it is already rooted past the place where storms reach. Dora had written a letter 6 weeks before she died, and she had addressed it not to Carla's mother, who was already 3 years in the ground by then, but to Carla herself, which was the kind of foresight that grief teaches a person when there is still time to act on it. The letter said 3 things plainly, and 1 thing only by implication. It said that Dora's affairs were in some disorder. It said that a man named Emmett Greer held a loan against her land, $740, with 18 months of interest, compounded at a rate that was legal but not honest, and that if Carla did not arrive before the 15th of November to contest the claim, the land would transfer to Greer outright, and the small house on it would be torn down before winter. It said that a man named James Calloway, who ran a cattle operation in the foothills east of Mineral Creek, had been Dora's nearest neighbor and her truest ally for 11 years, and that he was a man whose word did not require witnesses. What it said only by implication, what Carla read between the thin folds of the paper on the 7th day of the stage ride when she finally had enough stillness to read it properly, was that Dora had not written to James Calloway directly. She had written to Carla. She had sent Carla to James. And she had done so, knowing that James Calloway was a man who had been alone for 4 years, and who had replaced his grief with work so completely that he would never have gone looking for what Carla might be to him. Dora had understood that the only way to get those 2 people into the same place was to make it necessary. Carla had spent 3 days on that stage deciding whether she resented that or not. She had decided, provisionally, that she did not. Dora had never been a woman who arranged things to suit her own comfort. She had arranged things to suit the truth of them, and then she had trusted the people she loved to figure out the rest. So Carla had arrived. 11 days, $14, a broken trunk, That piece she learned on her first morning in Mineral Creek from a woman named Ruth Abner, who ran the boarding house 2 doors from the stage depot, and who delivered information the way some people deliver weather, plainly, without apology. Ruth told her, over a plate of salt pork and cold biscuits, that Emmett Greer had filed his claim the previous Friday, 3 days ahead of the legal deadline, and that the county clerk had processed it under pressure and posted a notice of sale. The notice named a date, Tuesday, the 8th of November, 6 days away. The sale was to be conducted at the county hall, and Dora's property would be auctioned in lots to settle the outstanding debt plus fees. Plus, Ruth said with a flatness that conveyed precisely what she thought of it, a $10 administrative surcharge that existed nowhere in the county statutes that she had ever found. Carla ate 2 bites of salt pork and set her fork down. She asked how much Dora's land was worth. Ruth said between 300 and 400 an acre, and there were 9 acres, so somewhere above 2,700, though Greer's people would arrange the bidding to keep the price down if no outside buyer came. Carla had $14. She asked about James Calloway. Ruth said nothing for 4 full seconds, which was, Carla would later understand, the most complex thing Ruth Abner ever communicated. It meant, he is a man I respect. It meant, he has had a hard 4 years. It meant, I've been wondering when someone was going to mention his name in connection with this business. It meant, be careful, but not too careful. What Ruth said aloud was, he'll be in on Thursday to pick up a wheel rim. He ordered, you can catch him at the smithy. She did not wait for Thursday. She borrowed Ruth's roan mare the next morning and rode east, into the foothills, following Ruth's directions, which were precise and practical, in the way that directions from a person who trusts the land always are. 4 miles east on the creek road, bear left at the split pine. Follow the fence line until the fence turns to stone. Then up the grade another half mile, and you will see the house before you see the smoke. Low and long, built from local stone in a color that matched the hillside so closely it looked grown rather than built. A barn to the north, with its doors open, 3 horses in a paddock. A kitchen garden that had been cleared and turned for winter, the soil dark and even, the kind of work that gets done before the cold arrives, whether the person doing it is grieving or not. She knocked. He came to the door with a hammer in his hand and looked at her with the flat, assessing look of a man who does not startle and does not rush. She told him her name. Something moved in his face, brief and controlled. He said, Dora's girl. She said, she wasn't my mother. She was my mother's closest friend. But close enough. He said, come in then. That was the beginning. James Calloway was 39 years old that November, which meant he had been 46 when his wife died. And no, wait, he was 39, which meant when Clara died 4 years ago he had been 35. And the 4 years of work as grief had built something in him that looked like stone, but was in fact more like scar tissue, harder than the original, and capable of feeling in a way the original had not quite expected. He had a face that recorded weather and work and said very little about either. His hands were large and competent and spoke a language his mouth mostly declined to use. Carla was 39 minus 13. That is, she was 26. And she had her own version of scar tissue, different in texture but similar in function. Her father had died when she was 16, her mother 3 years ago. She had been earning her own way since 17, which was 9 years of learning to read situations quickly and trust her own judgment and keep her expectations practical. She sat at his table and told him about the letter and the auction and Emmett Greer and the 6 days remaining. He listened. He did not interrupt. He set the hammer on the table between them, not as a threat, simply because his hands needed somewhere to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked to see the letter. She gave it to him. He read it twice, the second time more slowly. He set it down. He looked at the hammer for a moment, and then at the window, and then at her. He said Dora was a woman who knew how to arrange things. Carla said, he said, I had an arrangement with her. It wasn't formal, but it was real. She waited. He said, if anything happened to her, I was going to look after the land, keep it from being taken apart. She knew I didn't want it for myself. I just didn't want Greer to have it. Carla said she knew that. He said she didn't mention it in the letter. Carla said no, she left that part for you to say. He looked at her then, a long, level look that had something new in it, something that was not assessment exactly, but was adjacent to it, the way you look at a piece of ground when you are beginning to understand what it might grow. He said, I've got enough cash set aside to cover the debt and the fees, but Greer will run the bidding up if he knows it's me. He's been looking for a reason to file a claim against my north pasture for 2 years. She said, so you need someone he doesn't know. He said someone who can stand in front of a county clerk and establish a legal interest in the property. Otherwise, Greer contests any bid I make on procedural grounds, and the clerk, who is afraid of Greer, lets him. The word legal hung in the air between them. Neither of them named what it implied. Not that day. Carla went back to Ruth Abner's boarding house. She lay on the narrow bed in the room that smelled of cedar and old wool, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Dora. She thought about how Dora had known James Calloway for 11 years and had never once written to Carla in that time and said, "There's a man here you should meet." She had been too precise for that, too honest. She had known that a good man offered as a gift is not received the same way as a good man encountered in necessity. She had known that Carla would not be able to evaluate James Calloway properly if she arrived expecting something. So she had arranged necessity instead and trusted them both to do the rest. Carla decided she did not resent it. She had passed provisionally on the stage, and now she passed fully, lying on that cedar-smelling bed, looking at the ceiling, with the letter folded on the table beside her. But she also decided, with the same clarity, that whatever happened next would be her choice, fully hers. Not Dora's arrangement, not James Calloway's practical solution, not the county clerk's ledger making something true by writing it down. Hers, if she got to that point. She had 5 days and $14, and a problem that needed solving in a specific order, and she was good at specific orders. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday at the county clerk's office, working through the posted regulations, with the patience of a woman who had been navigating official obstruction since she was 17. The clerk was a man named Hedges, thin and dry and nervous, in the way of a person who has been doing something he knows is wrong long enough that he has stopped thinking about it directly. He answered her questions in the narrow way of someone providing exactly what the law required and nothing more. She did not push him. She wrote things down carefully in a small notebook and thanked him each time and came back the next day for the next piece of it. She found what she was looking for on Wednesday afternoon. A provision in the county sale regulations enacted 9 years prior, which stated that any creditor-initiated auction of private real property required a minimum of 3 independent bids to proceed to settlement, and that if fewer than 3 independent bids were recorded, the sale must be continued to a new date, no fewer than 30 days hence. The provision had been inserted to prevent exactly what Greer was doing, inserted by a previous county commissioner who had apparently seen Greer, or someone like Greer, coming from a long way off. She walked to the smithy and found James there with his new wheel rim and told him. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "It doesn't stop him, it slows him." She said, 30 days is enough time to file a proper legal challenge if someone with a legal standing files it by the 13th. He said, "A legal interest in the property." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'll pay Holt Reeves to stand as a third bid. He's not afraid of Greer, and he owes me a favor from the spring." She said, "That takes care of the 3-bid requirement," he said, "and the legal standing." Neither of them said the word again. It was there, though, sitting between them the way the hammer had sat on the table 2 days prior. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to do something that doesn't benefit you." She said, "Dora's land would benefit me if it's protected." He said, "That's not what I mean." She said, "I know what you mean. I'm saying there are more than one reasons." He looked at her with that level look again. He said, "You'd want to know what the second one was. In time." She said, "I expect I'd figure it out myself." "In time," he said, very quietly. That was the closest either of them came to naming it in those first days. It was enough. Thursday, Friday. Carla rode out to the Calloway place each morning, and they worked through what needed to be done, the papers that needed filing, the precise wording of the legal challenge, the one letter that needed to go to a land attorney in the county seat. A man named Virgil Pruitt, who had handled 3 prior cases against Greer, would understand the situation the moment he read the first paragraph. In the evenings, if the work was done before dark, they stood on the flat rock behind the barn. The valley went gold at that hour, and then gray, and then the color of river water. They did not talk much at those moments. They had used the day's words. It was the silence of 2 people standing in the same place at the same time, which is its own kind of conversation. She learned small things. That he drank his coffee without anything in it and held the cup with both hands. That he checked the horses before he went inside in the evening. Every evening the same walk around the paddock, the same quiet word to each one. That he had a small shelf of books near the window, worn and reread, the kind of books a person keeps because they say something useful about how to be in the world. That he had not moved anything in the house since Clara died, not out of ceremony, but out of a kind of practical inertia. The house worked, so he had not rearranged it. It was only when she noticed the absence of anything that could be called decoration, any small personalizing thing, that she understood the inertia for what it actually was. He learned small things about her, too, though she did not know then what they were. She found out later, piece by piece, the way you find out what a person noticed when they begin to trust you enough to say it. 2 days before the auction. Virgil Pruitt's reply arrived on the Sunday morning stage, and Ruth Abner brought it to Carla's room herself, which indicated that Ruth had been watching the whole situation with more attention than her flat exterior suggested. Pruitt wrote 6 paragraphs in a hand that was small and exact, and entirely without sentiment. He confirmed that the 3-bid provision applied. He confirmed that a legal standing could be established by marriage, co-ownership filing, or a formal inheritance agreement, and that of these 3, marriage was the most immediately defensible in a county court, particularly given the existing procedural irregularities in Greer's filing, which he described as aggressively optimistic. He named his fee, which was $40, and said he could file the challenge within 24 hours of receiving the relevant documentation. He did not editorialize. He laid out the mechanism and trusted the people involved to operate it. Carla read the letter twice. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the street, the dust and the gray November light, and thought about her mother, and about Dora, and about the 11 days on the stage and the $14. She thought about James Calloway standing on the flat rock looking east while the valley went gray. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She rode out to the Calloway place. It was early enough that the frost was still on the fence posts. He came out when he heard the horse, which meant he had been awake and working already, which she had expected. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it in the cold morning light, standing at the paddock fence with the horses moving quietly behind him. He read it through once, and then looked up at the hills to the east, and she could not tell from his profile what he was thinking, and then he turned and looked at her. He said, "Pruitt is a man who knows the law and says what's in it." She said, "Yes." He said, "The mechanism works." She said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. The frost on the fence post nearest him caught the light, and then the light shifted, and it was just frost again. He said, "I want to be clear about something." She waited. He said, "I am not asking you to do this as a transaction. I understand that it came out of a transaction. I understand that Dora arranged the circumstances and that Pruitt has laid out the legal mechanism and that there is a practical case for it that doesn't require anything else. I understand all of that, but I am not asking you to do it as a transaction." She said, "What are you asking me to do it as?" He looked at the frost on the fence post. He said, "A beginning, if you're willing." She said, "I've been deciding whether I'm willing since I was on the stage 6 days out." He said, "What did you decide?" She said, "That I was provisionally." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I'm here in the frost at 6 in the morning, having ridden 4 miles because I wanted to give you that letter personally, and I think that's probably not provisional anymore." He was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face, brief and warm and contained, the way a good fire is contained, giving off more heat than light. He said, "I think that's right." He said, "Will you?" She said, "Yes." 6 words total. Neither of them had wanted more than that. They rode to Mineral Creek together that morning and presented themselves to Ruth Abner's brother, who was a justice of the peace and who married them in the parlor of Ruth's boarding house, in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes and was witnessed by Ruth and a hired hand named Sess, who had been eating breakfast when they arrived and who seemed entirely unsurprised, which suggested that Ruth had said something to him at some point, which suggested that Ruth Abner had understood where this was going before either of the principals had admitted it to themselves. Carla signed the papers as Carla Voss Calloway. She kept Voss. He had not asked her not to. The ceremony was on Monday morning. The auction was Tuesday. They sent the documentation to Pruitt by Monday's afternoon rider. Pruitt filed the challenge with the county court first thing Tuesday morning, 40 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. This was the part that Emmett Greer had not planned for. Greer was a large man, the kind of large that suggests comfort rather than labor, and he arrived at the county hall on Tuesday morning with 2 men flanking him and the manner of someone who has already decided how the day will end. He was 53 years old, and he had been acquiring land in Mineral Creek County for 11 years by the same method, which was to extend credit to people in difficulty at rates that were legal but constructed so that the interest accumulated faster than any working operation could pay it down, and then to call the loan at the moment most convenient to himself and least convenient to the borrower. He had 6 properties in the valley. This way, he had understood Dora Hensley's land as the 7th. He had not accounted for Carla Voss. He had known about James Calloway's potential interest, which was why he had filed early, ahead of the deadline, before Calloway could establish a counter-move. What he had not known, because it had not yet existed when he filed, was that James Calloway would do something in 8 days that Greer himself would never have done, which was trust a stranger completely enough to change both their lives. The county clerk Hedges came to Greer at 8:45 and showed him Pruitt's filing. Greer read it. His expression did not change. The 2 men beside him exchanged a look. Greer said to Hedges, "This can be contested." Hedges said, "It can be contested, but it will take time. The court date would be in January." Greer looked across the hall at James Calloway, who was standing near the door with Carla beside him. Carla was wearing her good coat. She had her notebook in her hand. She looked back at Greer with the flat, practical look of a woman who has been reading official documents for 3 days, and who is not afraid of a large man who acquired things by arrangement rather than by effort. Greer looked at James Calloway. James Calloway looked at Greer and said nothing. There were perhaps 20 people in the hall. Holt Reeves was among them, near the back, leaning on the wall, present because he had said he would be at Ruth Abner was there. Sess, the hired hand, was there, which was not strictly necessary, but was apparently something Sess had decided on his own account. Greer said to the room in general, in a voice that was reasonable and carried a clear threat underneath the reasonableness, "There are questions about the validity of this filing." Virgil Pruitt said from a bench to the left, where he had been sitting since 8:30, because he had arrived from the county seat the previous evening, because he had anticipated this moment precisely, "The filing is valid under County Statute 11-4. Any challenge should be directed to Judge Marsh's clerk." Greer looked at Pruitt. He looked at James. He looked at Carla. Carla did not look away. Greer said, "This isn't over." He said it to James, which was a mistake, because James simply looked back at him with the level, untroubled look of a man who has decided how he is going to handle something and has already handled it, and the flatness of that look communicated more clearly than any threat that the thing was, in fact, over. Greer and his 2 men left the hall. The auction did not proceed. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Holt Reeves said from the back, "Well, I guess I didn't need to bid after all." Somebody laughed. Ruth Abner said something to Sess. Hedges shuffled papers with the energy of a man who was relieved and was not going to say so. Virgil Pruitt came to James and Carla and shook hands with both of them and said he would handle the court filing in January. That Greer's claim had 3 procedural defects that would not survive a proper hearing, that they should expect the challenge to be withdrawn, and that his fee was $40 as stated. James paid him in cash on the spot. Outside the county hall, in the thin November light, with the valley stretching out below them, gray and cold and immense, James and Carla stood together for a moment without speaking. There was a refrain that had come to Carla on the stage, on one of the later days when she was thinking about Dora and about what the letter really meant, and it had stayed with her through all the days since. She had not said it aloud to anyone, but she thought it now, standing in that cold light. A debt paid in full and a life begun fresh are not the same thing, but they can start from the same moment. That was the refrain. She did not say it to James. She thought it was the kind of thing that would become true again later, at the right time, when they were further into the life it was describing. Greer's challenge was filed in the 2nd week of December and withdrawn on the 20th of that month, 3 weeks before the court date, as Pruitt had predicted. Pruitt sent a 1-paragraph letter to confirm it. He did not say anything else. He was Pruitt. By December, the frost had thickened and the days had shortened to the point where they were working, mostly by lantern light after 4 in the afternoon, and the house at the Calloway place had changed in ways that were small and specific and cumulative. Carla had brought 2 things from her trunk: a set of small watercolor paintings her mother had made, mountain studies done on stiff paper with a fine hand, and a mechanical clock of her father's that had a clear face and kept exact time. These were now on the walls and the shelf. The house looked inhabited in a new way, not decorated but attended to, the way a place looks when the person living in it has decided it is worth paying attention to. She had also taken over the kitchen garden plan for the following spring. She had a notebook for this as well, a different notebook from the legal one, and she spent evenings filling it with sketches and plant lists and the specific logic of the soil she had been assessing since late November. James watched this without comment, and then one evening said, "There's another 2 acres on the south slope that gets more sun." "If you wanted," she said, "I wanted." He said, "It's yours." Then she said, "It's ours." He looked at her across the lantern light that contained warmth. Again, he said, "It's ours." They were learning each other's language in the literal sense as well. Carla had grown up hearing her grandmother speak a dialect from the valley country further north, and she had some words and phrases in a variant of the old speech that was different from anything James knew, and she taught them to him in the evenings, the words for weather and land and the quality of light at a specific hour, because those were the words that fit the life they were building. He was a careful and precise student. He said the words slowly and correctly, and did not perform enthusiasm about them, but simply added them to his vocabulary, the way he added anything useful, quietly, and for keeps. He taught her the land, not in the way of instruction, but in the way of company, taking her along when he rode the fence lines and the high pasture and the creek boundary, saying the name of a thing when a thing needed naming, letting the rest of it accumulate through presence. She had good instincts, quick and practical, and he did not condescend to them. When she corrected his reading of the South Creek drainage, which she had assessed more recently than he had, and which had shifted in the autumn rains, he adjusted his plan without ceremony, which she noted and did not comment on because it was simply the right thing to do. Dora's land was formally clear by the 23rd of December, the title recorded properly with the county clerk under the names Carla Voss Calloway and James Ira Calloway. The 9 acres sat to the west of the Calloway place, across the creek, and James had a long-standing intention to run a small hay operation there, that he had delayed because it required more hands than he had had available. Carla said she could manage the hay side if he handled the water rights negotiation, which was more legal than practical, and which she was now, she pointed out, better equipped to navigate than he was. He said that was probably true. They spent Christmas at the house. Ruth Abner came out with her brother, the justice of the peace, whose name was Frank, and who turned out to be a laconic and competent man who spent most of the afternoon helping James rehang a barn door that had been warping since September, which was the kind of help that lasts longer than any gift.
Sess came.
Holt Reeves came with his wife, a small, precise woman named Ada, who looked at Carla for about 4 minutes and then talked to her for 3 hours as if they had known each other for years, which was, Carla thought, the best kind of meeting. The day was plain and full and warm in the specific way of cold days, when a house is holding its heat and the people in it are not performing anything for each other. In the evening, when everyone had gone and the dishes were done and the fire had settled to coals, James and Carla sat on the flat rock behind the barn for a while. There was no frost that night. The air was still, and the valley was very dark, and the stars above the eastern hills were the kind of stars that look close enough to have a temperature. They sat close enough that their arms were touching. Neither of them had arranged it. It was simply what the cold suggested, and what neither of them moved away from. He said, after a long quiet, "I want to tell you something." She said, "All right." He said, "When you said there was more than one reason, on the road, by the smithy, do you remember?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I knew what the second one was. That day I didn't say it because I didn't have the right to say it yet. But I knew." She said, "I know you knew. I knew you knew." He said, "I'm saying it now." She said, "I know." He said, "Clara was the person I built this place around. When she died, I kept building because stopping seemed worse. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I didn't think waiting was something I was still doing." She said nothing. She let him finish. He said, "But I was. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until it knocked on my door with a broken trunk and a letter from Dora Hensley." She said, "The trunk is still broken." He said, "I'll fix it." She said, "I know you will." Silence. The stars. The dark valley. His arm against hers. She said, "My mother would have liked you." He said, "Dora told me the same thing. About 3 years ago, out of nowhere. I didn't know what she meant at the time." Carla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dora." He said she was a woman who could see further down the road than most people. Carla said she trusted us to catch up. He said we did. There was a word that came to her then, one of the words from the northern dialect she had been teaching him, a word that meant something close to the feeling of recognizing a place you have never been to, the sense of a thing fitting that you did not know was missing. She said it. He repeated it after her, slowly, in the careful way he had, getting it exactly right. She said, "That's the one." He said, "I'll remember it." He did. She heard it from him, unprompted, on a morning in late February, when the first real thaw came and the creek ran loud and the south slope above the garden was showing the first gray-green press of things coming back up through the frozen ground. And he stood at the kitchen window with his coffee held in both hands and said the word quietly. To himself, or to her, or to both of them, and she looked at him from across the room and understood that he had been storing it for the right moment, and that this was the right moment, and that he had known it. A debt paid in full and a life begun fresh are not the same thing, but they can start from the same moment. She had thought it in November, cold, gray light. She returned to it now in February, thaw light, and the sentence was the same, but heavier, weighed down with all the weeks that had happened inside it, the frost on fence posts, and the legal filings, and the 23 days between Pruitt's first letter and Greer's withdrawal, and the Christmas dinner, and the flat rock, and the northern word said in the dark, and the broken trunk now mended, sitting solid and latched in the corner of the room, holding what it was meant to hold, fixed, right, fixed to last. The south slope went in that April with 2 acres of kitchen garden and a 3rd acre of trial beds for the cut flowers that Carla had been planning since December, and that Ada Reeves had agreed to buy the surplus from a small income but real, the kind that compounds over time if you attend to it. James ran the fence lines and the water work, and Carla ran the beds and the books, and neither of them confused their work with their ownership, because both of them owned all of it equally. Dora's 9 acres went into hay that spring, the first cutting in late June, and James drove the first wagon to the feed merchant in Mineral Creek himself and came back with a number that was better than he had projected, because Carla had identified a drought pattern in the previous 2 years that suggested hay prices would run high through the summer. And she had been right, and he told her she had been right in the plain, direct way he acknowledged all true things, without excess, and she said she'd been lucky, and he said no, and she said a little, and they left it at that. The flat rock behind the barn remained their place. They went there in the evenings when the work allowed it, not every evening, not as a ceremony, but as a return, the way you return to a thing that has proven itself. The valley kept doing what the valley did. Light came across the eastern hills at a low angle in the summer, and a lower angle as summer tilted toward fall, and the grasses changed color, and the creek level dropped, and the horses in the paddock moved in their quiet, steady way. 2 heartbeats in the house, now, and the house knew it, and the land knew it. Emmett Greer came to Mineral Creek once more that summer, in July, with a new man and a new angle. The new angle was a water rights dispute on the east boundary of the Callaway property, a thin claim that rested on a survey line that Greer asserted was different from the recorded line. He arrived at the property on a Tuesday morning with the new man who was a surveyor he had brought from the county seat, and Greer presented himself at the fence line with the courtesy of a man who believes the other party will blink. James met him at the fence. Carla was beside him. Greer's surveyor was a small man with a level in his hand, and he looked at the terrain with the expression of a professional being asked to say something he doesn't entirely believe. Greer said, "I believe there's a discrepancy in the east line." James said there isn't. Greer said, "I'd like my man to run the survey." James said, "Pruitt has the recorded survey on file, and he'll send a copy to Judge Marsh's clerk by Friday if you'd like to proceed through the court." Greer was quiet. Carla said, "We have the creek survey as well from April. Both lines are correct as recorded." Greer looked at the two of them. He was a man who operated through arrangement and preference, and the expectation that people without resources would eventually accommodate him, because the alternative cost too much. He had not updated this understanding to include a woman with 3 notebooks and a land attorney on standing retainer and 11 months of accumulated documentation, and now he was standing at a fence line in July heat being shown what an incorrect update looks like. He said after a moment, "I'll be in touch." He was not in touch. That was the last they saw of him. Pruitt sent a short letter in August noting that Greer had filed no new actions, and that the prior withdrawal was holding, and that the file was, in his professional assessment, closed. He charged no fee for the letter. It was the only thing Virgil Pruitt ever did for free, and they both understood it as the nearest thing to an editorial he was ever going to offer. By September, the house had one more thing in it: a wooden box, roughly made, built from scraps, of the same stone-colored timber as the house itself, sitting on the shelf above the books, next to the mechanical clock and below one of Carla's mother's mountain paintings. Inside the box was a copy of Dora's letter, clean and folded, on new paper, transcribed in Carla's handwriting because the original had gone too thin to survive much more handling. And beneath the letter, in the same hand, the line she had come back to and come back to: "A debt paid in full and a life begun fresh are not the same thing, but they can start from the same moment." Dora had not written those words. Carla had. But she thought Dora would have recognized them. The autumn came. The garden came in. The hay on Dora's 9 acres was cut a second time, a smaller cutting, the late yield always smaller, but good, and it sold at the price Carla had estimated, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. On the flat rock one evening in October, James said the northern word again. The valley was doing its October thing, all amber and iron and fading light. She said it back to him. He said it again, and she said it again, and they said it back and forth 2 or 3 more times, until they were both nearly laughing, which was not something either of them did loudly or often, but which happened in small contained amounts in the evenings on the flat rock, which was the right place for it. The thing Dora had looked down the road and seen, the thing she had trusted 2 cautious, competent, grief-shaped people to find their way to, was not rescue, and was not transaction, and was not even precisely love in the way that word usually gets offered. Large and general, and not quite accurate, it was something more like this: 2 people who had been alone in the specific way that loss makes a person alone, which is not empty, but is very quiet, had found themselves in the same quiet, and had decided slowly. It is the most ordinary thing. It is also, when it happens after loss, when it is chosen rather than fallen into. when it is built from frost mornings and legal documents, and borrowed mares, and broken trunks, and northern words for untranslatable feelings. Dora knew that. She had known it further down the road than either of them could see. She had trusted them to catch up. They caught up. And on that flat rock, in that October light, with the valley going amber and iron and the stars beginning to show at the eastern edge of the sky, they sat in the quiet that had become the best thing either of them had. Not the absence of something, the presence of it. A debt paid in full and a life begun fresh are not the same thing. But they can start from the same moment, and sometimes that is exactly what they do.